Great. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. My name is Christopher Thomas. My title is Data Compliance Analyst. I work for the Office for the Lancaster County Homelessness Coalition. This is the June 2025 Training and Equipping Series session. We'll be here on Zoom for an hour until 10 a.m. I'm going to have to go promptly at 10. I apologize. So I won't be able to stick around. I'll try and be mindful of time and leave some time at the end here. I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat that will be helpful. One is a link to our YouTube page. That is where our recordings of previous sessions of both this series and other T&Es are kept, right? So if you're interested in watching recorded versions, including this, once I upload it later, that's on our YouTube page. The second link I'm going to share here is a link to a public Tableau dashboard. Tableau is a piece of software that lets you kind of make visualizations. And the data that I'm going to be presenting can be found there, right? So it might be interesting to play around with, whether while I'm talking or after the fact. We'll get into more of exactly what that means here in a minute. So starting a little bit late, but we're going to plan to talk for 45 minutes. And I'll try to leave some time at the end for question and answer. So anything that comes to mind, you can put it in the chat. I won't be distracted by that, or write it down. I'll open up to questions at the end. This is the welcome introduction. So again, welcome. My name is Christopher Thomas. We're going to be talking today specifically about something called the System Performance Measure, right? So this is a hour-long session talking about Lancaster County's homeless systems data. And that can mean a lot of different things. But in specific today, we're going to talk about the System Performance Measure, or I'm just going to refer to it as the SPM from here on, right? So we'll talk about what is the SPM. We'll talk about how Lancaster County has performed since 2020. Those are the years that you'll be able to look at on that dashboard if you call it up. We're going to talk about how we compare to our neighboring CoCs. And we're going to also talk about how we compare to national data. And actually, I didn't write it down here, but we'll talk about how we compare to ourselves too. Right? Are we improving, getting better, getting worse, stagnant? What's going on? So, like I said, there's previous versions of this. I think this is maybe the fourth of these I've done, and they've been on different topics, all having to do with data and performance. Not all about the system performance measure. There's ones that talk about the APR, point in time count, the housing inventory count, the LSA. It's a lot. I wouldn't recommend listening to all of them in a row because it's just a lot of me talking about different reports, right? But it's useful stuff to know. It's really important, right? Because it has everything to do with how Lancaster County is understood by our biggest funder, the federal government, via HUD. And the last one too, we looked at our last SPM, right? So you can look at these over the years and see how things have changed. But if you've been to these in the past, this one will actually be pretty similar to the last. We'll be looking at the next version of the same set of data. So talking about the System Performance Measure, the SPM, our performance between 2020 and 2024, making comparisons. Like I said, it's available in the link in the chat. So you can follow along using that. You can also look at whatever you want. Every CoC's data, right? In many cases, a CoC is a county. In some cases, it's many counties put together. In some cases, it's almost a whole state put together. Each have their own version of the system performance measure that they submit. And all that information is public. Now, normally it's public in that you have to go looking for it on HUD Exchange and search for a specific CoC if you know what you're looking for, what year you're looking for. The Tableau dashboard, that link I sent is really useful because HUD does all that work for us very kind of them to like put all this information in one place where you can really easily look at it, and you can filter, based on what you are interested in. So it's really, really worth looking at, really interesting stuff. So a little bit before we start about what is the system performance measure? What are the SPMs? Like I said already, they're used by HUD to judge the performance of each of the country's CoCs. And this is straight from HUD. This is a quote. The intent of these selection criteria are to encourage CoCs in coordination with Emergency Solutions Grant Program recipients, which also means us. We use CoC money and ESG money to pay for homeless services, and all other homeless assistance stakeholders in the community to regularly measure their progress in meeting the needs of people experiencing homelessness in their community, and to report this progress to HUD. And then listed here, there's not that many of them. There's only 8 performance measures. Length of time persons remain homeless is measure 1. Measure 2 is the extent to which persons who exit homelessness to permanent housing destinations return to homelessness. What does that mean? It means that a person was exited from a homeless service project. Just pick a random example. They were in a homeless shelter, an emergency shelter. They left, they moved into a permanent housing situation. They got a rental by client. That's a permanent exit. The question then is, did that person return to homelessness? We're not going to have time in this hour to look at everything in Empower Lancaster, our HMIS, our database that tells HUD that, but take my word for the fact that they have got accurate ways of saying a person was homeless, they were housed, and now they're homeless again. That's measure 2. Measure 3, number of homeless persons, just the overall count of people in the system. Measure 4, employment and income growth for homeless persons in CoC program funded projects, right? So did our clients gain income, and what kind of income? Did they gain earned income, meaning employment income, or did they gain other income, meaning something like SSDI? You're not working for this unemployment income, but it is still a monthly income. Measure 5, number of persons who become homeless for the first time. So again, using HMIS data, how many people in a 12-month period appear to have been homeless for the first time? 6, oh, I'm sorry, there's only 7 actually. 6 is not being used right now. It exists, but we don't need to worry about it because HUD's not measuring it. 7, successful placement from street outreach and successful placement in or retention of permanent housing. So measure 7 is kind of the big one, right? What percentage of the people who exited our programs of any type of homeless program, right? So think of the whole continuum: street outreach, emergency shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing. What percentage of people exited to permanent housing? What's our success rate, right? And then the 8th one is data quality. So what is our percentage of missing exit destinations? People who we have no exit for, we don't know where they went, right? We'll look at 1, 2, 4, 7, and 8 together. And we're going to look at us, right? Lancaster City and County CoC, we're PA 510. We're also going to look at neighboring CoCs on this side of the state. So we'll look at Chester, Berks, Eastern, and York. And that Tableau dashboard is really handy. I mean, it lets you pick what CoCs you want, and it lets you pick even what CoC type you want. Like, do I want suburban CoCs or urban CoCs? You name it, it's all in there. So we're going to get into it here. I will try and, well, first of all, not talk too much, but I'm trying to give enough context that each of these makes sense, right? In each case, there's like a little intro slide, and then we'll look at the actual data from 2020 to 2024. So the first measure here, length of stay, right? The average length of stay in days in ESSHTH. Well, a good example here of context, right? What does that mean? We've got many different types of projects serving people who are homeless in Lancaster County. Measure 1 is going to look at ones that people stay in temporarily, right? So we think about what are these project types? It's ES, it's emergency shelter. SH stands for safe haven, which we don't have in Lancaster County. And TH stands for transitional housing. These are types of projects that are meant to be temporary. There's a reason why we don't have PSH in here, because PSH is a permanent solution. You might stay in PSH for years and years. That's fine. We're going to narrow this down, or HUD's going to narrow this down, just to the projects that are meant to be temporary, and look to see how many days on average do people spend in these projects, right? Now, crucially, length of stay is not the same as length of time homeless, because your length of stay starts when you enter one of those projects, right? You're in a shelter, you're in a transitional housing project, and it ends when you leave, when you exit. You may have been homeless for a day before you entered, a year, a decade. You may have exited to homelessness. You may have exited to a permanent housing destination. It needs to be kind of constrained so it can work as intended, right? So we're just looking at length of stay. In HUD's eyes, and this is actually a really important contextual point to make for all of these, right? HUD is not ever going to tell us what the right number is. Like, here's an example. They're never going to say, we want an average length of stay in days of 30, and you get measured, your success is measured on how close you can get to 30. That would be kind of convenient. They don't make it too convenient. We do know that they want a shorter length of stay, and that's kind of all we know, right? The other thing we know, and I've got slides at the end to talk more specifically about this, is they want to show that we're improving and that we compare well to other CoCs. And that'll make more sense here in a second. So I'll pause here for a second. I know it's a lot to take in, but what you're looking at right now is system performance measure data for the 5 CoCs I mentioned for the last 5 years. On the left side as a table, right, where each of those blocked parts of the table is a year, with those CoCs ranked from best, meaning in this case, least, lowest length of stay, to, for lack of a better word, worst, right? Highest performing to lowest performing of those 5 CoCs. That is part of what you're seeing, right? Then to the right of that, you've got the actual data, right? The length of stay in that year. And then to the right of that, you've got the national average. So what you've got here is the ability to look at to see how has our performance changed each year for the last 5 years? How have the other CoCs' performance changed? And how have our performance compared with theirs and with every CoC in the country averaged together? Then, the other thing you're looking at on the right-hand side of the screen is a graph that shows all of that. There's different points on this graph. Don't worry too much. It's called a box and whisker graph. The reasons why don't matter too much. It's just the form that they chose, right? But each year, we got 2020 on the far left, 2024 on the far right. In each of those years, you should see 5 points. Sometimes they're grouped really close together and it's hard to see which is which, right? But I marked in red Lancaster County. So you can see both on the left and on the right, how have we been moving, or have we been moving, right? We're moving one direction or the other. How have the other CoCs been moving, and how do those compare? And I'd like, if possible, just to distill it down to a single statement, right? So Lancaster County's length of stay in days in shelter and transitional housing since 2020 has been improving. The same can be said of our neighboring CoCs. So even though we have improved, if you look on the right, you see that red dot starts around 200, stays around 200, but has dropped again, starting at 205, ending at 124. Right, so our average length of stay has decreased by about 80 days since 2020. And we've also, the thing I should have mentioned, I apologize. You'll notice that third column there, they're green or they're red. And so I just used some conditional formatting in Excel to say, okay, did we beat the national average or did we not beat the national average? So you see the first 2 years there, that 205 and 202, we were above, we did not beat the national average. But in 2022, 2023, 2024, we actually did beat the national average, right? So the national average has actually kind of gone up. Not tremendously, it went up by 27, but we're doing better on measure one. We're not necessarily doing better than our neighboring CoCs. In fact, as we go through these, you'll notice that some CoCs are standouts in different measures, right? I wish I could tell you why, but it's impossible to know unless they tell us. York, in this example, has always been the highest performer. You'll see they went from 63 to 73, 71, 50, 48. York has been the lowest point on that graph every year since 2020. And you'd notice that we and Chester, or we and Berks, are kind of neck and neck. So this is the first measure. We will talk at the end also about why, what does this lead to? Why does this matter, right? So if I say, oh, we've been improving, what does that mean? There will be time at the end here where I'll use some concrete examples to say why this matters. The other thing I should have absolutely said for context that can't be stressed enough, that goes for all of these, is this comes 100% from HMIS data, right? So it's all coming out of Empower Lancaster. Nothing else goes into these, right? And we don't get to change the numbers, right? It's a very straightforward process where you run a report. The report has got very specific parameters that HUD programs, and then you hand that report straight to them. They can't run it themselves. This is also important context because HUD can't access our HMIS. They have no access to it. So we have to be the people who pass it off to them. But it is a kind of a blind process. It's designed so that I can't say, I don't like 124, actually it's 104. I don't get to pick the number. It's all done automatically, right? So that's measure one. Like I said, if you have any questions or anything comes to mind here, you're wondering about anything, either make a note or just put it in the chat and I'll come back to it. And that could include questions about like, okay, so what does that mean? Why does this matter? Why has this gone down? What is this, what can we do about this? All those things are totally on the table. Just put them in the chat and we'll try to address them in the last 10 minutes or so. Okay, so the next measure, measure two, returns to homelessness, percent returns to homelessness in 6, 12, and 24 months. So when we look at this, like I said earlier, the report is programmed to call up all the people in the past 2 years who appear to have exited a homeless service project to a permanent housing destination, right? So my example client, call him Christopher, who is in an emergency shelter and exited to permanent housing. That's in the system. It's also programmed to look in those 2 years to see who appeared in another program serving people who are homeless, right? So if Christopher was an emergency shelter, he moved into a rental by client, that's great. If 18 months later, he showed up with a new enrollment in a street outreach project, that's a project that only serves people who are homeless, we know that he was homeless, housed, and homeless again, and he would show up here. So less is better. We want a lower return rate. The perfect return rate would be 0. That would mean that 100% of people who exit our programs for at least 2 years, as far as it looks back, they did go back into homelessness. Now they break this down 3 ways. Right? They look in the first 6 months, the first 12 months, and the first 24 months. Now I'm not going to throw 3 separate pages at you. We're just going to look at the within 24 months of exit, so the longest window, to see how we performed. And same format, right? On the left is a table with those 5 years, all the CoCs, again, ranked. So the highest performer is at the top of those 5, the lowest performer is at the bottom, national average is on the right, and then a conditional formatted comparison of who did not beat the national average, right? And on the right is the graph. Now, if you're thinking back to a minute ago, looking at that length of stay, those points were all kind of like pretty close to each other, and they like moved a little bit, but they were basically all in the mix, right? This is very different. You'll notice now part of it is that the scale is different. The very bottom of this graph is 4%. The very top is 30%. But you also notice that even within that range, there is a lot more variation, right? And there's also variation in terms of our performance, Lancaster County's performance. So you'll notice that we started at 18%, we dropped again, went up, and then went up again. So we've got this U shape in the last 5 years that show that we had a higher rate of return. So 18% of the people who in the last 2 years exited to permanent housing destinations returned to homelessness. And then it dropped. It got better, right? 9%, 8%. And then it went back up, still below its high in 2020. So last year, oh, sorry, I should have mentioned this earlier. This is a really important context too. This is, like I said, 12 months. It's between the period of October 1 and September 30, right? So the most recent one you have here is October 1, 2023 to September 30, 2024. That's the completed year. So it's never going to be like brand new. Like this isn't, when you look at that 2024 number, that's 16.5%. A person who returned to homelessness yesterday, they haven't shown up yet. It's a delayed process, how all this works. But the bottom line here, again, like kind of like trying to get to the point, is that Lancaster County has historically done quite well on returns to homelessness. And even though our return rate has gone up, which is not what we want, it is still competitive in terms of Eastern PA CoCs, and it is also better than the national average, right? Even in the most recent year, when other counties, including Berks and York, struggled, right? And this again is important. It's hard to keep it all in mind here, right? But remember the last one, York was the highest performer. Well, now York is the lowest performer, right? And that's another thing it's important to think about, and you can use your imagination as we go through these, that even though these are independent, they do inform each other, right? And they have to do with strategy and policy and how do you run your homeless service system. I'm not saying this is true, but maybe York County emphasizes short stays in these projects, right? We're going to push to keep those stays really short. And maybe one of the consequences, a negative consequence of that is that people return more frequently because maybe it takes longer than that CoC. And again, I'm not saying this is true, I'm just using a hypothetical scenario here. Maybe that CoC's policy, even though it's helping them in one place, it's hurting them in another. It's a very real possibility, right? And HUD expects that we're the ones who decide that and know that, right? It's our policies that inform this, right? And then, counter that, look at Chester. Chester went from 17% to 15 to 15 to 8 and now 5%, right? So speaking of who's doing what, who's going where, Chester appears to be going in the right direction, right? Their 5% is not just low for Eastern PA CoCs, it's much lower than the national average. They seem to be doing really well in that, right? So Chester is doing something right. We're not saying we're doing something wrong. We're just someplace in the middle, right? We're like literally the middle point in 2024. So again, I'm going to try and keep moving here. It's just 9:30 now, and I've got more slides to get through. I'm going to start talking a little faster. But again, any questions, just drop them in the chat. Okay, so we have 3 more to go through. We've got gained income, measure 4, right? So this is going to look to see of our clients who left, right? So people entered a homeless service project. They had an entry date. They had entry assessments. I'm sure you've all seen the HUD assessments. You do the financial assessment at entry. You figure out how much money they make every month, and then they're going to leave at some point, right? They'll exit that program, and you'll get the same assessment. You'll have the opportunity to update it. Maybe a person came to you with no monthly income, and they left with monthly income. Maybe they came with some monthly income, and their monthly income increased. This is going to count every time a person increased income between entry and exit in those 12 months. And the increase is not important, right? So when we talk about a person on a fixed income, as long as we reassess them every year, their income should increase at least based on whatever inflation adjustment Fed's made, right? So even if it's a tiny increase, it still counts. So in this case, more is better with the highest possible percentage. And here you'll see we have kind of been, we were in the middle of the pack, more or less, closer to the middle. And we have, even though our performance actually has bounced back to where it was in 2020 or thereabouts, other CoCs have actually improved a little bit faster than we have. So even though we have kind of moved up, we're past the national average, other CoCs are around the same point as us, or in the case of York, like considerably higher. You'll see York in 2024, hopefully you can see my mouse here. They're this outlier here, 2024, York is really performing well. So again, this is one, I'm going to try not to talk too much on all of these, but again, we're talking about what percentage of our leavers, people who exited a homeless service project, showed an increase in income between entry and exit. And again, our performance has been fairly consistent. And at least if you look in this time frame, going back to 2020, we've kind of got back on the ball here. We still have got some room to grow, but we are not heading in the wrong direction here. It's also worth pointing out, CoCs have off years, right? Sometimes that has to do with struggling in a given year, or it has to do possibly with them kind of like having to tighten up their data collection and like where they miss a lot, right? So York, using them as the example again, if you look in 2021, speaking of outliers here, York only had an 8% gain, right? And that could mean a lot of different things, what might have happened there. And again, I guess we'll have to talk about why does this matter, or what is our best guess about how HUD sees this. Unfortunately, while they could have tried to explain this, HUD is pretty merciless in terms of how they see this, right? So to their eyes, they would see that York really seems to be slipping, right? They dropped by 24% in 2 years. Does not look good. At the same time, York has somehow managed to double their increase. So they are, unlike us in this measure, we've been pretty consistent. York's been really inconsistent. They've been bouncing. They fell really far and they bounced way back up, which could mean a lot of different things. But it does mean that at least for this 1 year, they did outperform all these other CoCs. Okay, that was measure 4. We're talking about income, which is big. It's important. That really does apply to like every program type. Any homeless service program, you're going to be assessing income because income's relevant, right? It's really difficult to improve your housing situation if you don't have sufficient income. And I was saying earlier also how even though these are measured separately, they do inform each other, right? The last example I used was, well, maybe you push really hard for a short length of stay. Maybe that means your clients are less prepared to remain housed because they had less time to stabilize and they have more returns. This is kind of similar with measure 4, income, and measure 7, exits to permanent housing. They get measured separately, but I think everyone would agree that they're linked, right? The capacity of clients to obtain and maintain permanent housing is going to be affected by their income, right? So measure 4 and measure 7 also kind of can be paired together, and you can think of these as being related. And our success on one, well, you can also say the same for 4 and 2, but our success on one informing the others, right? So even though 4 is kind of like, can be farther down the list in terms of what are we really working on? We focus on housing, right? Income actually is really important. But for measure 7, right? Second to last year, clients gained permanent housing, successful exits from emergency shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing. So this is going to look again at 12 months. We're just looking at October 1 to September 30 at the percentage of people who exited from one of those projects, shelter, transitional housing, or rapid rehousing, to a permanent housing destination. That means Short list, actually. Rental by client with no subsidy, rental by client with a subsidy, that would be like a voucher, for instance. Owned by client with subsidy, owned by client without subsidy, and then staying with friends and family, permanent tenure, are our permanent exits, right? We're not going to be looking here at street outreach or permanent supportive housing. And I will take a few seconds to talk about why, right? It's useful context. We're not looking at street outreach here because street outreach actually has a lower bar to clear to count a successful exit. That's because street outreach, HUD's expectation is that street outreach takes clients who are on the street and improves their housing situation in any way, right? So the best example here would be if you have a client, we'll just use Christopher again, who is being served by a street outreach program. They get enrolled by street outreach, they get served by street outreach, and then they move into a shelter bed. If street outreach exits that person at that point, that was a successful exit for street outreach. We got like I said, a lower bar to clear. Any improvement in housing situation counts. On the other side of this, you have got permanent supportive housing, which also doesn't get counted here. And why is that? Well, that's because a person enrolled in permanent supportive housing, they're already in permanent housing, right? So for PSH, they're not going to look to see who exited to permanent housing. First of all, because they're already in permanent housing. And second, because just as street outreach is a somewhat different mandate than these other project types, PSH does too. PSH is also succeeding when it maintained permanent housing for clients, right? So they divvy this up so that they can put projects together that have the same expectation, right? And again, similar to the returns, rather than throwing just page after page at you, we're just going to look at one of the possible versions of this. But you can see all of them on that Tableau dashboard, right? So if using the old example, you say, well, I really want to know about 6-month returns. The Tableau dashboard has that. Or you want to say, well, I don't care too much about these. I run a PSH project. Tell me how those did. That's also on the Tableau, right? You could look at measure 7, whatever, maybe 7C, I think, is the PSH, right? It's all on there. But to make it work in an hour here, I'm just going to focus on the kind of the most representative measures as far as I'm concerned. So again, back to the point here. Talking about exits from shelter, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing in 12 months, and what percentage of them were positive. So more is better. 100% would be perfect. Since 2020 to 2024, same format. Here we see how we did on the left, compare with other CoCs numerically, compare with the national average, pardon me. And then on the right, how does that graph out? How do we look year after year? What's our kind of, what motion, what direction we're heading in? This one has, at least so far, the most kind of bounce in terms of our numbers. Because in 2020, we had, I would say by far the highest positive exit rate. But in every subsequent year, so 2021 to 2024, among those eastern half of the state CoCs, we have been in 5th. Now, you could look at 2021, 2, 3, and 4 and say, well, we are stabilized and we are improving. And that's true, right? We did improve in 23 over 22. And oh, no, actually, we're kind of stable, 23 to 24. But other CoCs have also, if you look at the overall shape of this graph, it's, except for the one outlier of Chester, they're also trends, they're kind of like shifting down in our direction too. And you'll also notice, if you look at the national average numbers, that they have not gone up either, right? The highest national average here was 2020. And the lowest was 2023, but still, it's kind of taking us all on a similar journey. And unfortunately, if you don't filter, this is like a little pro tip here. If you don't filter that Tableau dashboard, what you're going to see is just going to be like just a huge block of dots, right? Because there's so many CoCs. I don't know how many there are off the top of my head here, but if you put them all together and you combine everyone's off years and everyone's great year and everyone's this and that, you just have everything all over the map, right? So it really does work best to filter it down like this. But this is kind of what it all comes down to, right? I said it becomes important, that's true, but it really is, at least in my view, our exit rate that is like the single best measure of how successful our homeless projects are, right? Are we succeeding at helping people who are homeless, who engage in homeless services, to end their experience of homelessness permanently, right? They go to one of those permanent destinations. And what I see here is not anything that scares me too much, but it shows that we have room to improve. And I would say, honestly, of all the measures, that's the one where we have the most room to improve. Okay, we're doing good on time here. I'm going to go to one more last slide, and I'm just going to tell you to keep this fresh in your mind, because the last one we're going to look at is sort of the flip side of this, right? So this is permanent exits. Of our exits, what percentage were to positive permanent housing destinations? And I was just say also really quick, more context. You'll notice these are all percentages, right? All the ones I've shown you. Well, except for the length of stay, right? That's different. But increased income, returns to homelessness, positive exits. The next one we'll look at will be data quality. They're all percentages. The reason they do it that way, you think about it, it's pretty obvious, is that they need to compare CoCs across the country, the country, that are of wildly different sizes, both in terms of geography and population. And they have to kind of standardize that. Right? So the fact that there's fewer people living, I think, in Chester County, they still have to be able to compare us to them like apples to apples, or Eastern CoCs, basically every part of the state that's not one of the ones here and not Montco and not Philadelphia is in that humongous area, but we're still just looking at a percentage, right? So while Chester certainly exited fewer people from their projects than we did, like a raw number, they had a greater success rate, right? Of that number, they had a higher success rate. They were the standout, actually. They had an outlier year here in 2024. They managed to exit 70% of their clients to permanent housing, which is, far and away the best, a really, really high number. But Chester has been consistently doing pretty well. High 60, low 60, high 50s, and now low 70s. But last thing I'll say about that, the thing to remember here is that when we talk about permanent positive exits, and we're talking about data quality, we're talking about the same thing, right? Because the measure here, measure 8, is missing exit destinations. Data quality for our leavers. Leavers just means a person who exited a program in the time period we're looking at, right? So in those 12 months, they were open for at least a day, and they were exited. This is, like I said, basically the inverse of those positive exits. This is people who we don't have an exit for, right? So when we think about these two things, we're talking about kind of the same big pile, and we're separating out which pile do you fit into, right? We looked at our positives a minute ago. That was what? That was 30%. Now we're going to look at a different pile, which is who did we not have an exit destination for? The best way to think about this is if we haven't got an exit destination, right? If we're missing an exit, I guarantee that you can't be in the positive exit category, right? So these are mutually exclusive. If you had a positive exit destination, I guarantee that you were not a missing exit, and vice versa. So in this case, less is better. A perfect data quality would actually be 0, right? Because we're talking about error rate, the lowest error rate possible. And this is everything wrapped up, right? So this is going to contrast with measure 7. This does include street outreach. This does include PSH. This is just every homeless service project, excluding CE. Coordinated entry doesn't count for this. Who was missing exits? So want a lower number if we can get it. And here we see also a lot of variation. You see variation in our performance. We're bouncing around, or the red dot again on the right. We also see variation in other CoCs' performance. Now, those first 2 years, those dots are pretty closely clustered. Between 2022 and 2024, they really opened up. And in 2024, they're quite far separated here. Everyone's basically separated by about 10 points, or percentage points rather. This one is, like I said, it's basically just as crucial as positive exits. Because, like I said, if you're in 2024, you'll notice that our number got quite a bit better. We almost managed to have it from 66% to 34%. But if you are one of that 34%, you could not be one of the positive exits, right? So every time we have a missing exit, we guarantee that we're not going to get any credit, basically. This is something that I feel we've done a lot better at, right? We kind of went from doing quite well, certainly beating the national average, being competitive with other CoCs, to flying off the handle in 2022 and 2023. We got it back closer to our neighboring CoCs in 2024. And a lot of that was due to closer monitoring of data quality, more data cleaning. We got closer, and I'm confident, because again, we're well into what will be reported as the 2025 year. We've continued to make progress there. So I feel confident in saying that 34.3 number, which again is still above the national average, will fall again the next time we do this. But this is another one where Chester is really the standout, right? They've got, basically 1/6 our error rate, and they've been consistently a high performer. So they, again, are showing that there's feasible ways to improve that data quality, not marginally, not to get it back competitive, but to really, really narrow that down to very close to zero. So this is one that we have a lot of ground to make up. And it's one that is kind of like I've said twice now, we're kind of like doubling up, right? If we get this down, we're at the exact same time increasing our chances of improving, not guaranteeing, but it increases our chances of improving our positive exits, right? Because having an exit destination is necessary for showing a positive exit. So this is also really crucial to understand, is that they do look to see how many, what percentage rather, of exits are you missing? And they also compare that to us to ourselves and us to our other CoCs. Okay, so I'm running out of time. I'm trying to do 3 more minutes here just to talk a little bit more about context, why this matters, what this means for us, right? There's a lot of different things that HUD looks at when they make funding decisions for CoCs, right? For CoC funding, to see who gets what dollars, who gets what funding requests met, not met, cut back, what bonus projects get awarded. And the system performance measure is a huge part of that, right? And it makes sense, right? They want to say who's performing, and HUD is more likely, say it's good or it's bad, they're more likely to spend money on the high performing CoC. The CoC that says, I can take your money and I can do the most possible with it. That's who's more likely to get their funding requests met and renewed. And they give us points. They're not always super transparent about how they give us those points. So we're left in some ways to kind of make our own surmise about why did they do that? What do they like that they give us points for? What do they dislike they give us points for? One of the things they want to see, obviously, is that we perform well on the system performance measure. That's one part of it. And they also want to see that we have a plan to improve. And obviously, those go hand in hand. Because if it's possible, and I've seen this in my time here, that we might have lost points on the actual system performance measure, but we gained points on our plan to improve. But those are a cycle, right? If I did not do well, but I write a compelling plan to improve, I should see that number improve in the future, right? That number should get better, should get lower, whatever it is. It should improve based upon my plan, if my plan's successful. So what they really want us to be doing is creating a cycle of improvement where we say we had this, we planned on this to improve it, and then this number went up, went down. And you just build on that. That's what they hope to see. And the other thing that I've seen, and it's kind of like a behind the curtain thing. You can't always tell what all goes into these decisions, these scoring decisions, right? And of course, while we're doing our best, every other COC is also doing their best, right? And we can't always plan. Sometimes, as you saw in this national average, things trend down, trend up. We can't control that. All we can do is control our own performance. It does really seem to me, based on recent experience, that they are judging us more against our own performance than they are against the national average or our neighboring COCs. Now, exactly what calculus they're using, and it may literally be a formula. I can't say, they don't tell us this, but I'm not sure exactly how that works together. But recent experience shows that our performance can be still better than average, but getting worse, right? We're performing worse and lose points for that, even if our performance is still good, right, compared to the national average or compared to our other COCs. If we're heading in the wrong direction on our own terms, we can lose points. At the same time, we can be heading in the right direction, even though we are getting outcompeted by other COCs and receive points, right? So the best example I can give for this is our returns to homelessness. On the most recent, when I say NOFO, just think of this as being the renewal application. It used to be an annual application process. As best we know, it's going to be a biannual, every other year, one now. The most recent, we lost points on measure 2, our returns to homelessness. Now on measure 2, we're still doing pretty well. We're beating the national average. We have historically done quite well compared to other COCs, and we are still far from the bottom, right? We're doing pretty well here. And yet we lost points on this. Why did we lose points? Well, from my perspective, as best I can tell, we lost points because our performance, best just look at these dots, has gotten worse. Our return rate has gone up. And this caused us to lose points, right? Counterexample, where we gained points most recently, gains permanent housing, right? This is the one where I was saying, hey, we've got a lot of ground to make up, right? Chester has more than double the exit rate that we do, and we're below the national average. We actually gained points most recently on this measure. I believe we gained points because we have improved our performance. We have not improved over 2020, but we've improved over recent years. We are heading back in the right direction. So these are all things that factor in to those funding decisions. And I'm already over time, although I don't think I see anything in the chat. So hopefully, again, last thing I'll say here is, if anyone has any questions, I will try and take at least a few minutes here at the end for them, but I'm going to keep on talking. You can also, I can see you on my screen here. If you click the hand up icon, if you've been holding your question to say it, I'll look for the hand up icon and I will take that as an indication I should talk a little bit less and leave more time for questions. Thank you. So last few slides here. What have we been doing well? What's working? I mentioned data cleaning, right? That has been working. Data cleaning on a monthly basis, and then a big clean at the end of the year, right? So rather than, like I said, and it's hard to describe without showing you a visualization here, but the report is automatic, right? The report spits out a file. That file is zipped. It's full of other files. You hand that to the HUD system, and then they whisk it away, right? That doesn't mean that you can't change the data that makes the report, right? So if at the end of the year, you take that report, you look at it and you say, hey, we got to make up some ground here. We're missing a lot of exits. We need to go back and try to figure out if we can get some of those, right? You can do that. You can actually change the exits. Go to the exit assessment, enter a missing exit destination. You just added one more positive exit, right? So that, despite being very time consuming, because we're talking about thousands of people a year here who are exited from our programs, it has paid off. That's why, in my best estimation, that's why measure 7 we got points for, because we managed to pick it up in the most recent submission. And then two is kind of maybe two is the second point here, a little more having to do with that monthly monitoring, monthly check-ins, monthly data quality reporting. We've got more exit assessments. We also have more annual assessments, right? So in order to show that a person gained income, is the best example here, got to have a positive, or got to have a financial assessment at entry and another at exit. Anyone who's used the system knows that you're able to copy assessments, right? So if when a client is entered, they stay in, and someone does an annual assessment for them. This happens commonly with Pathways, with rapid rehousing, which is a longer project, right? And they reassess them at their annual with a higher income. Regardless of who exits them and who does the exit assessment, they'll be able to copy the annual, and that's also going to get the credit for it. So by getting more assessments in, some organizations have gone above and beyond and tried to do during assessments, we would call it. So whenever something changes, they'll reassess. That means we're kind of putting more pressure towards improving those exit destinations, and that has worked. And then also simplifying the way the projects are set up in Empower Lancaster in HMIS has also helped. For reasons that would probably take me most of an hour to explain, you'll have to take my word for it, but some of this like streamlining will also pay off. It hasn't paid off yet, but it's going to when it goes into effect and some time passes. So that's the other problem with this is that nothing's overnight. The data cleaning can be, but the systemic stuff, you need to do it, make the change, and then let it run for a while to get the result. And then where do we need to improve? Where can we still improve? We still need to keep working on exit destination and income completeness. Because like I said, probably 5 times now, you can't get credit for something unless you assess it, right? HUD is, like I said, they're merciless, right? They're not going to say, it's okay, right? We did your best. They expect that we can measure something numerically, right? Or measure a category change, homeless to housed, and then we can present a percentage that met that criteria in order to get credit, right? So we have to keep their desires in mind when we make these plans, because they're who we have to please with these SPMs if we want to get our funding requests fulfilled. And then the last one here, it's anyone's guess, but we need to try and break through kind of the ceiling here. How can we improve beyond a certain point for exits, positive exits, for income? What are the ideas we could bring to bear here to say, hey, we're kind of sitting in this 30s, maybe mid 30s exits. Maybe we'll stay there if we keep doing things the same way. What could we do differently to let us break through that ceiling and kind of chase after Chester, for instance, right? And like I said before, HUD expects to see this be a kind of a virtuous cycle, right? You say, here's my performance, here's my plan to improve the performance, then the performance improves, and you write an even better plan, and you just continue to roll these things in the right direction. Obviously, that's happening against the backdrop of reality, which is also merciless and is always changing, and there's things we can't plan for, right? But HUD leaves all of that to us, right? They expect that we plan well, have good plans to improve, and that we follow through with them. Okay, so I think I saw one question in the chat here. Yeah, Emily, I can send you periodic reports on your organization's data, positive versus missing, definitely. That is something that we can provide kind of as frequently as you want it, right? And I realize I'm really out of time here, but different CoCs do it different ways, right? Nothing stops us from doing it frequently, monthly. Some CoCs just say, year's over, let's do it, right? But we have more, we should try to be more frequent than that, right? So, if you have a certain, I'd like it this frequently, or I'd like it every quarter, whatever, I can definitely do that. And it'll come out in a format that will be, at first, like I was saying, when I said the reports get spit out by the HMIS, they go to HUD. They're like it is like Greek. I mean, it's being generous. It's very hard to discern, but I can explain it to you in ways that will hopefully make sense and really can get down to the client. Like, okay, so we're missing 30% exit destinations. Who are those 30? I can tell you exactly who, when they exited, da, 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 da. All that exists, and I can help you discern that.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I'm going to end the recording and the call. Like I said again, I'll just share these again. The O4C YouTube page has these recorded, and they're available to watch. This will be up there once I get it downloaded from Zoom. And then here is the Tableau dashboard. So to look at what I was looking at, that will take you there. So thank you all. This is my email address and phone. Anything you want to throw at me, questions, thoughts, feedback, it's welcome. And thank you all so much for joining. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the time. Bye.